So, okay, a couple things I want to clarify about the next couple weeks, since we're now in week 8, which is hard to believe how far we've come. Okay, so as I think I mentioned last Thursday, we have a week dedicated to questions around justice and trials. And so today we'll actually be talking a little bit about a number of things, one of which are some of the trials that took place of Nazi perpetrators immediately after the war. And we'll also expand this a little bit to talk about questions around comparative genocide and the ways in which other trials in the case of Cambodia and Rwanda have also taken place. And these, of course, are two examples of genocide that have happened after the Holocaust. So I'll give a lecture this morning that lasts maybe a half hour or so. And then we're going to turn to Peter Weiss, or in German, Peter Weiss, his play called The Investigation, which is about the second Auschwitz trial. And we'll have a very special opportunity today because we're actually going to be able to see a performance of a portion of it. So it's very, unique for our class, and so I'm really happy about that. I should also say that you have a book due for Thursday, which is a literary trial. This is by Bernard Schlink. The book is definitely in the bookstore. I checked. Hopefully, if you don't have it, you should go get it. It's a fairly quick read. However, it's an interesting take on trials, not least of all because the protagonist, the person on trial, is a woman. And we haven't, as you'll see today, everyone who's on trials that we're looking at are all Nazi men. So this is not to say that there weren't women who were also tried. In fact, I'll talk about that on Thursday, that a number of the female SS officers in charge of the women's section of Auschwitz were also tried for crimes against humanity and convicted and, in fact, hung. So it's just that the ones that we look at today happen all to be dominated by men. And gender-wise, I would say, I don't know the exact numbers, but predominantly, overwhelmingly, the perpetrators were male. In week 9, we'll be looking at Art Spiegelman's Maus, which is a graphic novel. Hopefully, again, you've procured that book. Again, it's at the bookstore if you haven't. That's on Tuesday. And in between that, I think I had mentioned, and I'm going to kind of just go over this again. I'm going to send you an email reminding you. We have 3 survivors who you have the opportunity to meet. Now, I realize that it may be impossible for you to come to one of them. You need to come, well, all of them. You should come to one. And it's going to be, you have to sort of like figure out how you can do this. Ideally, you'll go to the one for your section. So if you're in sections I, J, K, or L, ideally you're going to meet Zenon Neumark on this Friday at Hillel, which is on 574 Hillgard Avenue, at either 11 or 12 o'clock. If you're in the 11 o'clock time, you should try to come around then. If you're in 12 o'clock time or 1 o'clock time, try to come later. I don't want 90 people in one time and 10 in the other. But try to come around the time. Neumark, I realize you may not have his memoir. Some of you may have ordered it, which is great. You'll be able to use that in your written response. If you do not, I PDF'd a number of key chapters and put it on CCLE, and you can access them right there. So we're on CCLE week 8, it says Zenon Neumark memoir excerpt. You click that, and it's like, 30 pages or so. He, as you'll see from this story, and I'll talk to you about all 3 of the survivors actually a week from this Friday, he was someone he was Jewish, and he worked in the Polish underground, assumed a new identity, and his perspective on the Holocaust was very much someone who almost was moving in between Jewish communities and perpetrator communities. And so he was part of the underground resistance movement. So very different experience than what many of the people that we'll look at, or other testimonies that we looked at, saw. On the following Friday, that is a week from this Friday, Friday the 10th, we have 2 survivors coming to class. They're coming to section, rather. That's Erica Jacoby and Henry Oster. Now again, you may have ordered their memoirs, which is great if you got them on Amazon. The bookstore does not have the memoirs because they didn't place the orders. However, if you have them, that's great. You'll have more access to their material. If you do not, you are also required to watch either part of a film or an interview with one of them. There's a film called Swimming in Auschwitz, which you can now watch online. It's about 60 minutes. It's primarily about Erika Jacobi and her experience at Auschwitz. And with regard to Henry Oster, you can watch his Shoah Foundation testimony online as well. And you have to just create a login on this site in order to do that. And I know that does work for sure. I changed the time where you turn your response paper in to the Sunday the 12th rather than having it due the Thursday before to give you more time to both meet the survivor, to watch the material, and process the experience. So hopefully that'll be fine. I decided that it should be due on Sunday at midnight because we need to also have enough time for the TAs to grade them, and we have the exam the following, yeah. So, yeah. Let me just talk about the assignment, which I stuck in week 9. So the last turn-in response. So this one is in some ways a little bit creative, but it's not entirely free form. That is to say, I'm asking you to confront the fact that you're one of the last group of students who are going to actually talk to Holocaust survivors, because they're obviously biology means most of them are in their 90s, and UCLA students who are probably taking this class in maybe even 10 or 15 years won't have that opportunity. But I thought, what if you wrote a letter to a student in the future who's potentially in this class? And so I thought 2050. Let's make it more than 100 years now into the future, or so to speak, 100 years from the events themselves. And I want you to really reflect on the significance of first-person testimony. So this paper basically is a letter. You're writing a letter to another UCLA student who potentially is enrolled in German 59. And I want you to reflect on not only the aspects of what was entailed in listening to and being able to question and interrelate to a survivor, but also the change between first-person testimony and the representation of testimony through other media like film or memoirs or books or various institutions that preserve memory like museums and memorials. So what's the significance of the eyewitness account, and particularly the eyewitness that you can meet and talk to? That's really what I want you to reflect on. Now, you have to actually use one of the survivors that you meet as the basis for this. So it's not theoretical, it's actually very specific. I want you to interact with Erika Jacobi, or Zenon Newmark, or Henry Oster. And you will have read some of their stuff, either as a memoir, or you watched a film, or you watched, his testimony. And you're trying to figure out, what does each do? And it's not so much one's better than the other. I mean, I think it would be very reductive to say, well, meeting a survivor was really great, but seeing it on film was, pretty good. That's not very, we haven't moved very far. But I wonder, how do they complement each other? How do you think about the difference of the experience? And what does it mean for a student, in the future not to have that opportunity? And again, I don't think it has to be I pity you that you don't have this opportunity, which is, you may. But what does it mean that you had this opportunity? So what knowledge might you be able to provide to that student based on the experience that you had? And so think through what that could be. That's what the problem is, and that's what the prompt is about. So yeah, I hope, yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe you actually would have an opportunity to send your letter to the future one day, which would be interesting. Questions? It's a little bit creative, I know. I think you got it. Okay. So, good. I'm going to then go to a lecture today. And, yeah, I'm going to start here. Actually, I'm going to start with a video. Yeah, let me bring this up. So unfortunately, I had this video has existed in multiple formats over the years, and the site that used to be hosting is no longer hosting it, so it's slightly different than how it's looked in the past. But this is footage, if you clicked on it, from the Nuremberg trial, which took place between 1945 and 46. And what you see in this picture here are 24 men who had been arrested by the Allies for war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And they're on trial, and what you have at the back here, these are probably U.S. or at least Allied, maybe British soldiers, and they're guarding, so to speak, the men who are on trial up here. And the judge, this is a court where the judge is British, and this was established again shortly after the end of the war. And the idea was to put these men on trial right away for their crimes. And so the judge asked them whether they plead guilty or not guilty to the crimes of crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and war crimes. And all of them enter, as you'll see, and as I play this, they all say in German that they are not guilty, charged with these things. So I wanted to play this a little bit because it gives us an indication, one, of the relationship of these men to the court itself. And this becomes an interesting question. It's like, do you even respect the court? Do you understand what's going on? Does it make sense that that maybe what you did kind of falls outside the scope of what maybe humankind considers to be appropriate behavior? Do you believe in justice? General questions like that. Let me see. Actually, I wonder if it started earlier. Right. Yeah. Okay, I think he's just moving. So I'll tell you about who some of these people are after we let it play. So he says, before I answer the question as to whether I'm guilty or not guilty in front of this court, he's going to give some kind of statement.
I informed the court that the defendants were not entitled to make a statement. You must plead guilty or not guilty.
I consider myself, in the sense of the accusation or the charge, not guilty. So, nicht schuldig.
Yes.
So, this is no.
That would be entered as a plea of not guilty.
Chuckling from the court. I consider myself, in the sense of the charge, not guilty. I consider myself not guilty.
In the absence of Ernst Katzenbrunner, erkenne ich im Sinne der Anklage nicht für schuldig. Nicht schuldig.
Not guilty.
Walter Funk. Nicht als schuldig. Gerhard Schaaf. In keiner Weise schuldig.
I am in no way guilty.
Was ich getan habe oder tun musste,
So what I've done or what I had to do, I have a clear conscience before God and before history and before my people. I'm in no way guilty. So, in any case, you get hopefully the point. They all plead not guilty. So, a little bit of background about this trial. So, this is the first major war crimes trial to take place after the Second World War and the Holocaust. It's a trial by an international war tribunal convened by the Americans, the British, and the French. The judge I mentioned is British. You have 24 fairly high-ranking officers on trial, although it should be noted that a number of people were not put on trial. Hitler was not put on trial. Goebbels was not put on trial. Himmler was not put on trial. They all committed suicide in the end of April of 1945, and so they were not obviously able to be tried. Reinhard Heydrich, who basically organized the final solution, and the Einsatzkommandos, you might remember, was killed in the summer of 1942, so he was also not put on trial. Other people like Adolf Eichmann had fled and were not captured until many years later. So these were Nazis who were captured largely after the war. And the indictments were, these were the actual indictments: participation in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishment of a crime against peace, planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression and other crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And conspicuously, as I think I mentioned before, the crime of genocide was not what they were being tried for. Genocide was a term that was available, but it wasn't a term that could be put on trial. There was no UN Convention for Genocide Prevention. There was no criminal court in The Hague. That's something that wouldn't come into existence, in fact, until 1993. So, decades later. These were the men who were all charged. And I just say something about the highest, the highest ranking Nazi that was found was Hermann Göring. And so he was the original head of the Gestapo, the secret police. He was considered second in command under Hitler. He was Hitler's successor. That changed maybe towards the end of the war, but for the vast majority of the time, he was Hitler's number two. Of the other people that were there, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was the replacement for Reinhard Heydrich. So he was in charge of he was the chief of security. He was the highest ranking SS officer. He oversaw all the Einsatzkommandos in the East. And so he was someone saddled with the death of potentially millions of people. A number of the other folks that are there, names you may not recognize, they were the ones put in charge of occupied territories. So in the case of Hans Frank, for example, he was put in charge of all of Poland between 1939 and 1945. So we know all the death camps were in Poland. He oversaw all of Poland as the kind of what was called the general governor. Keitel, who was listed here, where's Keitel? Yeah, Wilhelm Keitel was the defense minister. These were all the people actually put to death by hanging. Mr. Sauckel, Fritz Sauckel, was in charge of all the slave labor programs. Cees Inquart was in charge of the deportation of the Dutch Jews in the Netherlands, responsible for overseeing around 100,000 people being killed. And so the people that they arrested and found, many of them, in fact, well, not many, I'd say half of them, 12 of them, were put to death. They were put to death by hanging. In the case of Göring, he actually committed suicide the day before he was supposed to be hung. The others were either variously acquitted because they weren't involved in war crimes directly, or because their role was somewhat ambiguous. To give you an example, Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect. He was the guy who designed all the staging for like the Nuremberg rally. He designed, kind of the monuments and memorials. He wasn't exactly involved, as far as we can tell, in the planning of the final solution. And he served a short prison term. I think it was 15 or so years. So that was the first trial. The other major trials, and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, Thursday, when I talk about Auschwitz more. Rudolf Hess. This is different than the Rudolf Hess that we saw here. They're two different ones. This was the guy who was the commandant of Auschwitz. He was the chief inspector of all the concentration camps. He was in charge of Auschwitz. He was captured. He was tried actually in Poland. He was also hung in 1947. We have his full sort of memoirs, which he wrote in 1946 while imprisoned. And if you're ever interested, it's called in English Death Dealer. And it details very, very explicitly what he was doing. There were two major trials related to crimes committed at Auschwitz. One happened in 1947, and another happened in 1963 to 1965. The second Auschwitz trial, which is the one that Weiss's play, The Investigation, that we read for today, is based on, was of lower-ranked SS officers and guards, some of whom participated and had knowledge of what was going on, but none of whom served major prison sentences for what they did. That is to say, they were often, well, the defense that they gave, which may or may not be entirely true, was that they were often functionaries and didn't make decisions themselves, but were operating as kind of mid-level commanders under authorities that were much higher ranked. And so generally what the trials did was the people that were in charge, like the commandant, they were the ones that would be hung. Yeah, talked about that. So this is these are the men. Just as so, Göring I mentioned. This is Nuremberg. He's would have been hung if he didn't kill himself. Keitel is hung, Kaltenbrunner is hung, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, I think all the guys on the front here. Others got various sentences ranging from 10 years to acquittal, 20 years, life imprisonment, and so forth. So, interestingly, I mean, in West Germany alone, this is really interesting. There were a total of around 13,000 cases of Nazi criminals. And insofar as that happened, around 100,000 people were put on trial. So a lot of people, but by no means all the people involved. Now, granted, not all the ex-Nazis lived in West Germany. Some lived in East Germany. Others fled. Others lived in other places. But what's, I think, really interesting is that we know that in 1942, at the height of the genocide, you have around 900,000 active SS officers who manned all aspects of the concentration camp system, from handling deportations to evacuations of ghettos to rounding up of Jews to sorting of goods to the actual carrying out of the final solution. It's extraordinary that of 900,000, only 6,000 actually served any prison time. It's a very remarkable difference. And of those 6,000, only 163 were imprisoned for life, and 12, outside of the 12 that were killed in Nuremberg. So a total of 24 were actually put to death for their crimes. Now, I'm not arguing necessarily that death is the answer. I'm just pointing out that there's a wide range of, we know there's a significant discrepancy between the number of people who were actively involved in the campaign to carry out the Nazi Holocaust and the number of people that actually were finally captured, tried, and then paid a price of some sort for what they did. There's a discrepancy. Now, this is something that actually, as I'm going to kind of broaden just very briefly, this is something that we've seen, which is the post-genocide trying to come to terms with the crimes that were committed. And in some ways, the inability of legal systems to do so. That is to say, there's a real challenge in how to find a way to adjudicate crimes of this scope, of this nature, of this extent, especially when you have a whole network of people and complicity at all levels, from the highest levels of the state to the lowest levels of local authorities to broadcast media to propaganda to educational ministers to finance to railways, all involved in complicity. And so how do you assign guilt? How do you assign, especially when courts are always about finding whether a single person is guilty of certain crimes? Like, how do you understand that question of being almost like a cog within a much greater system? And that's been a kind of an ongoing struggle. It's been a struggle for, I'd say, since the Holocaust. Now, I had mentioned that a number of weeks ago, I think it was towards the beginning of class, that one of the ways that the world community has dealt with this struggle, this question, was with the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So one, designating that such a crime exists, and that such a crime is precisely targeted at an ethnic, religious, racial minority, and that it's also recognized that that crime is going to have complicity and participation of a broad swath of participants. And that this convention was proposed and ratified in 1948 by a number of countries. Interestingly, the U.S. only ratified it in 1986. So theoretically, genocides that would have been that happened all the way up to 1986 would not necessarily have been something that the U.S. would have been involved with prosecuting. The first time that genocide as a charge was used was actually not until 1995, and so very recently, and it refers specifically to the genocide against Muslims and Croats in Bosnia. And so this is the first time that the court, in fact, the criminal court that was established in 1993, was ever used for charging people for the crime of genocide. And up until then, as I had mentioned earlier, a lot of different terms are being used. Crimes against humanity, these are the term that was used in Nuremberg. Ethnic cleansing becomes a term that's used widely. And then the question of, what constitutes genocide? Like, how does it reach the bar of being genocide? And partially that's a recognition of the crime as it's happening, but it's also a retrospective recognition. So with regard to the case of like Armenia or the Herero genocide, it wasn't recognized as a genocide at the time. So if we talk about the first genocide of the 20th century, which is generally considered the Herero and Nama genocide perpetrated by the Germans in colonial Southwest Africa, no one at the time called that a genocide. They definitely called it a massacre. It was reported as a massacre and even as race murder, but it was not reported as a genocide. And so subsequently, we refer to those crimes as a genocide because we have the vocabulary and we also have the conceptual understanding of what it is. Same thing goes with the Armenian genocide. Again, that's a conceptualization that now, with the perspective of history, we understand that rises to the bar of what would be a genocide. After the Holocaust, and there's more than one example that I could have given you, but the readings that I had were on these two, and I wanted just to talk briefly about them today because there's some structural parallels that I think are just ones I wanted you to be aware of. So one is the genocide that the Khmer Rouge carried out in Cambodia in the mid to late 1970s, where about 2 million ethnic and religious minorities were systematically annihilated. And one was the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, which was found to constitute genocide after the fact. So the debate, which is very interesting, that happened as the knowledge of the genocide unfolded was whether it is a genocide or whether it's something like, quote unquote, tribal violence, which is a way also, I'd say, of, in many ways, perhaps inflecting it with a certain racial, maybe even racist history, but not understanding it as rising to the bar of what constitutes genocide. And so this is an interesting question there. Samantha Power writes, and I put this at the bottom here because I think it's kind of provocative. We talk about never again. Like, never again will the Holocaust happen or genocide happen. We have to prevent it. And she says maybe the proper way to say it, and this is again very provocative, never again will Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. Perhaps that's the only way to say it, which is to say that history won't repeat itself exactly the same way. But if we're not aware of certain similarities, then we're also not going to say that these things constitute genocide. And so let's look at two examples. So this is these are pictures actually from an execution center in Cambodia where we know that 10 people survived out of around 14,000 who were killed. And one of the things that you see on these pictures, which are extraordinary, is one, the fact that you have photographs in the first place, and that they have numbers. Already, we think about those questions of dehumanization. We think about those questions of documentation, especially by the perpetrators of their crimes, that they also are documented on a very individual basis. We already see that this kind of documentary evidence is not only produced to attest to the crimes, but in some ways produced as a sense of, I think, pride on the part of the Khmer Rouge for the crimes that they committed. With regard to the Cambodian genocide, you have a number of structural similarities. I mean, one, you have, I think, this question about those in power having a kind of superior sense about who they are. They were violently against religious minorities, particularly Buddhist monks, as well as ethnic minorities, Vietnamese, Thai, and Chinese ethnic minorities, as well as Muslim minorities that live within Cambodia. The idea was to purge all of these minorities, religious and ethnic. With regard to the Vietnamese ethnic minorities, most statistics say that 100% of the Vietnamese were killed during the Cambodian genocide in Cambodia. It took about 4 years to carry out the killing of around 2 million people, which is extraordinary out of a country of around 7 million. US knowledge existed about what was happening. At the same time, one of the strategies that the Cambodians used as a common strategy was, of course, to cut off all media, kick out foreign correspondents, kick out foreign journalists, to really kind of cut the country off, to isolate the country. And yet, that isolation is never complete. That is to say, we still had knowledge of what was happening. In terms of tactics that are being used, death marches, starvation, slave labor, torture, detention, the state not only inhibiting movement, but also arbitrarily imprisoning people in terms of groups. So not just individuals, but groups. So if you are a Buddhist monk, you as a group are guilty of a crime. Burning of libraries, cleansing of thought. You remember the book burnings in Nazi Germany? The same thing happens in Cambodia. You have to kind of cleanse unsavory thought. You have the seizure of private property by the state. You have the regulation of sexuality. Again, often genocide has this. It's very, we may not always think about it, but the idea of preserving the race, of a kind of enforced heteronormativity, becomes something that you saw in Nazi Germany, something you see in Cambodia, and it's interesting. They use terms like this, like we have to sweep the nation, we have to discard the impurities. And if you remember the language from the Wannsee Conference, where Reinhard Heydrich talks about combing, going through and combing out the impurities from Eastern Europe, going from west to east and combing through. It's a very similar language that the Khmer Rouge will use several decades later. And just like the Nazis, extensive documentation, numbering, photography, logbooks, all of which document the extent of the crimes, yet people anonymously shot and buried in mass graves. Let me go to, I have a couple more slides I want to make sure I get to, and then we're going to go to Peter Weiss. So Rwanda is a somewhat different case in a couple of ways. For one thing, it happened extremely quickly, 100 days. We're talking about really 3 months, in which 800,000 people were killed, largely butchered by machetes. And so really there was extensive participation by local populace in the killing of an ethnic minority. So the majority Hutus, which were one racial group in Rwanda, essentially working to get rid of ethnic Tutsis who were considered to be, inferior, cockroaches is the term that was used, who comprised around 15% of the population. But what I think is really important to note is that the designation, this racial difference of Hutus and Tutsis, was in fact not local to the Rwandan population. It actually goes back to colonial history and the fact that Rwanda was colonized by the Germans and the Belgians, who invented the designations of Hutu and Tutsi in the first place. And so it's really quite stunning that the very genocide that happened almost 100 years later has antecedents in the history of colonialism, in which the countries were occupied by European powers in the late 19th century. And so this is, again, if I was, oftentimes we want to saddle all the guilt on, they say, well, it's all the Rwandans. Well, it's actually the Europeans. And that's an important thing to remember. When they instituted their own Nuremberg race laws in Rwanda in 1990, yes, they were citing 1935, but in many ways they were also citing 1890. which is when Rwanda and a number of other countries in Africa came under a European colonial rule. So that bit of background, I think, is important. But when the genocide took place, it was certainly well planned. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was actually coordinated using a technology, in this case, the radio, in order to storehouses of machetes were already assembled ahead of time. And one of the things that you have here is it's not so much a genocide carried out by the authority of the state, although it was carried out in a kind of state crisis, which is the president had been killed in a plane crash and had given rise to a kind of political crisis in Rwanda, a kind of instability. It's often common that genocides take place in times of war or times of crisis or political uncertainty, because this is essentially like the ruse or the opportunity that gives rise to these breaches of human propriety, these breaches of law, these excesses. Now, what I think is really interesting, and this is going to take us to the legal aspect, is the ways in which the victims and the perpetrators have interacted after 1994. And one of the things that happened is that there were so many people accused of crimes. Somewhere, the numbers are between 120 and 130,000 ordinary citizens participating in crimes. So these are Hutus who committed crimes against ethnic Tutsis. It would be very hard to put them all on trial by a state-run trial. And in fact, maybe that wouldn't be a way that made the most sense to imprison them all. And so they've created a kind of a version of what's called truth and reconciliation committees. And in Rwanda, these are called gacaca courts. And these are community-based justice where perpetrators and victims actually talk to one another and are part of a kind of community of witnessing in which the crimes are confessed. Victims are, in a sense, in the same space as the perpetrators. There's a tribunal that's community-based, and the idea is to promote healing and a kind of form of restorative justice. The idea here being that the perpetrators do serve jail time, but they serve significantly diminished jail time, sometimes between 3 and 10 years versus life in prison. And they actually come face to face with their victims. They come face to face with the men and women that they murdered, or even the people, the survivors, many of whom have scars from machetes. And part of this is because the perpetrators and the victims still live together. One of the things that's happened, after the war in other countries, especially with the Holocaust, most of the victims did not continue to live in Germany or even Europe. They moved away. In the case of Rwanda, most of the perpetrators and the victims will continue to live in the very communities. And so this idea of how do you rebuild social bonds in a community that has had such violence, this particular approach, which has a long history of the way in which Rwandans had also handled courts, is something called, I mentioned the term gacaca, which basically means sitting and gathering in the grass. So the idea of gathering together. And that you can even see, like children in the corner over here, people with umbrellas, people that have come out to listen. I imagine people come and depart. And this is a very kind of fluid, and it's a model for thinking about possibilities of justice that are community-based and for rebuilding communities. So, yeah, these are the aims of these courts. So they establish the truth about what happened, accelerate legal proceedings, reconcile Rwandans, and also to look at century-old traditions of gathering people together and rebuilding a society, especially when it's been fractured by such extraordinary violence. Okay, in the interest of time, I put these slides up. I'm going to just leave that here for you, but you can look at it. I want to turn to Weiss because we have our play. So this is a play based on the second Auschwitz trial. And in many ways, it'll differ dramatically from the idea of the Rwandan court system. But yet, what Weiss has done is he attended the Auschwitz trials. He's taken the form of the play and produced something that he calls documentary theater. And the idea of documentary theater for him is to present material in order to confront the truth of the document. So the idea is not to kind of stage it like a courtroom and to kind of make it look as if we're going to kind of go back and hear the trial, but instead to use the material from the trial in order to read it, recite it, potentially learn it, potentially expose it, and certainly to document it. And his plays are performed. They're actually performed in Germany. They've been performed actually worldwide. They've been performed hundreds of times. And in many ways, they're dramatically, well, they're uncomfortable in some ways. And yet, they're based on documents that are from the courts. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a performance of a portion of the play today. And we're going to do it now because we have 6 amazing actors and actresses here who you know, all of whom will have parts. And they're going to come up to the front, and you're going to actually wear your part. You have a, yeah, you got to stick it on you. So who's Corporal Stark? Yeah, we have Paul. He's accused number 12, so you're going to actually get this stuck to you. You can put it on. And we have, I messed the 7th witness. Sorry about that. 7th witness. You're going to, that's you, Anna. And you're going to come up.
Okay.
Oh, actually, you're 7th witness? Okay. Good.
Where do I go?
Yeah, all in the front. Counsel for defense. Who's that? All right. There you go. 8th witness.
Thank you, Todd.
Okay. We need 2 more. We need a judge. Are you judge? Yes. Excellent. And prosecuting attorney?
Yes.
All right.
Guilty.
Okay, so who starts here?
I start.
Anna starts. I'm going to give you the microphone.
Okay, I'm going to take my phone.
Yep, now let everybody get settled here. You're going to have to gather a little bit, closer together.
Yours?
Oh, you can use mine, yeah.
Because I have a lot of...
Yeah, you have a lot of short lines. That's a good idea. Let me stick that on you.
Thank you. I've got a pocket.
I'll just project. Can you hear me in the back? So do you in the back come up?
Yeah, well, I think you can use the microphone. That's probably the easiest thing. So, the floor is yours.
The accused Stark was in charge of the reception squad. I was assigned to the squad as a clerk. Stark was 20 years old then. In his free time, he used to study for his high school finals. To test himself on the subject, Stark enjoyed putting all sorts of questions to the college graduates among the prisoners. On the evening the Polish woman with the 2 children were brought in, he was discussing aspects of humanism in Goethe with us.
What was the reason for their being brought in?
We only found that out later. The 8-year-old boy had picked up a rabbit and given it to the woman's 2-year-old daughter to play with. The rabbit belonged to a camp official, so all 3 were to be shot. Stark carried out the execution.
Could you see the execution?
Executions were carried out in the old crematorium in those days. The crematorium was directly behind the reception barrack. Through the window, we could see Stark with the woman and 2 children go into the crematorium. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder. We heard a series of shots, then Stark came out alone.
Accused Stark, does this description correspond to the facts?
I completely reject it.
What was your rank in the camp?
I was barrack leader.
How did you come there?
I was assigned to camp duty. Along with a group of other non-commissioned officers.
Were you made barrack leader right from the start?
That's what we were meant for. That's what we were used for.
Were you trained for this assignment?
We had our leadership course behind us.
Were you given any general instructions for your task in the camp?
Only a short indoctrination period.
What happened when you arrived at the camp?
There was a reception commission.
Made up of whom?
The commanding officer and the adjutant, the protective custody camp leader and the chief clerk.
What assignment were you given?
I was first assigned to a prisoner barrack. Most of them were young, high school and university students.
Why were they in the camp?
I believe it was because of their contact with the resistance movement. It was a collective sentence. They had been transferred there by Security Police Command headquarters.
Did you see the admission records?
No, it wasn't any of my business either.
What did you have to do then?
I had to see to it that the people got to work on time and that the numbers checked out.
Were there any attempts to escape?
Not under my command.
Were the people adequately provided for?
They each got their quart of soup.
What happened if the people could not or would not work?
That didn't happen.
Didn't you ever have cause to take action when prisoners broke rules?
That never came up. I never had to turn in a report.
You never struck anyone?
I never had to.
When were you transferred to the reception section of the political division?
May 1941.
What was the reason for your being transferred?
I used to go riding. One of the men I got to know that way was the chief of the political division, Lieutenant Presner. He asked me what I was by profession. When I told him I was a student studying for my final exams, he said, they were looking for people like me. A few days later, I received my transfer orders.
What were your duties in the reception section?
The first thing I had to do was to familiarize myself with the registration. Incoming prisoners were provided with a number. After that, personal records had to be set up and index cards filled out.
How did the prisoners arrive?
They were marched in, trucked in, or they came by train. Trains arrived every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday.
What was the reception procedure?
I had to stand by. When transports were announced, first, prisoners were assembled in front of the camp entrance. Then the transport leader handed over the transport papers to reception. Prisoners fell in for the count and were issued their numbers. At that time, numbers were not yet tattooed. Each prisoner was issued a number in triplicate on cardboard. One number he kept, one went with personal effects, one was attached to valuables. He had to retain his cardboard number until he was issued a cloth one.
What was your part in this procedure?
I handed out the numbers and conducted the prisoners to the personal effects barrack. Their prisoners were stripped, showered, and dressed. Their hair was cut, then they were received by reception.
What did that entail?
Personal records were filled out, questionnaires made up for reception were taken to the reception office. An admissions list was then brought up, listing the different categories: political prisoners, criminal prisoners, and racial prisoners. This list was then circulated to the various sections.
To which sections?
To the protective custody camp in Liebe, to headquarters, to the political division, and to the doctors. 12 copies went out for distribution with the daily dispatches.
Did you have anything more to do with the prisoners?
After reception, for me they were over and done with.
Accused Stark, were you on hand for the arrival of all transports?
It was my duty to be present.
When transports arrived, what were your duties?
All I had to do there was manage the record traffic.
What does that mean?
Some of the prisoners were held over. These I had to enter in the book.
And the others?
The others were transferred.
What was the difference?
Prisoners held over went to the camp. Transferred prisoners were neither received nor admitted. That is the difference between held over and transferred.
What happened to the transferred prisoners?
They were taken directly to the small crematorium for extermination.
Was this before the construction of the big crematorium?
The big crematoriums in the outer camp first went into operation in the summer of 1942. Until then, the crematorium in the old camp was used.
How were the prisoners transferred?
Lists were compared and names crossed out. Prisoners who were not to be received into the camp were marched into the small crematorium.
What were they told?
They were informed that they were going to be disinfected.
Weren't they uneasy?
No, they went in quietly.
We knew exactly how Stark would behave when he came back from a killing. Everything in the room had to be in order and absolutely clean, and we had to chase the flies out with handkerchiefs. If he spotted a fly, he would fly into a rage. Even before he took off his cap, he would wash his hands in a basin his flunky always had ready for him, on a stool next to the door. When he had washed his hands, he pointed at the dirty water, and the flunky had to run out for more. Then he handed us his jacket to be cleaned and washed his hands and face again.
I see Stark always, all the time. I can hear him call, "Move! Get in! Move your pigs!" And then we had to go into the chamber.
What chamber?
The chamber in the old crematorium. Several hundred women and children, later like packages. There were prisoners of war in there too. "Move! Get your clothes off," Stark yelled. I was 18 years old. I had never seen a corpse before. I just stood there. Then Stark started beating me.
Were there wounds on the dead?
Yes.
Were they bullet wounds?
No. They had been gassed. They were heaped up stiff, on top of each other. Sometimes when we pulled, the clothes ripped. Then we were beaten again.
Weren't the people required to undress first?
That was later in the new crematoriums where there were rooms for that.
Was Stark present there too?
Stark was always present. I could hear him shouting, "Move! Get those rags!" Once a small man hid himself under a pile of clothes. Stark found him. "Come here," he shouted, and pushed him against the wall. He shot him first in one leg and then in the other. Finally, he slid down on a bench, and then Stark shot him dead. He always liked to shoot the legs first. Once I heard a woman scream, "Captain, I didn't do anything." He yelled, "Get up against the wall, Sarah." The woman begged him not to kill her. Then he started shooting.
When did you first see the accused Stark at these killings?
In the fall of 1941,
Were these the first killings by gas?
yes.
Would you describe the old crematorium?
It was built of concrete. It had a 6-square chimney. The walls were covered by sloping embankments. The chamber was about 20 yards long and 5 yards wide. You had to pass through a small anteroom first, on the other side of the chamber. A door led to the first oven, and the second door to a room with the 2 other ovens.
Accused Stark, how large were the groups you had to conduct to the crematoriums?
On the average, 150 to 200 head.
Were women and children among them?
Yes?
Did you think it right that women and children should be a part of these transports?
Yes. The family liability laws were in effect then.
You did not question the guilt of these women and children?
We had been told. They had actively participated in poisoning springs and wells, blowing up bridges, and other acts of sabotage.
Did you also see prisoners of war among these people?
Yes. Those prisoners had, by issued order, lost all claim to decent treatment.
Accused Stark, in the fall of 1941, a large number of Soviet prisoners of war were brought to the camp. According to court records, you were instrumental in processing these contingents.
In connection with these transports, I only followed instructions.
What does that mean?
I simply had to march them off, take over their cards marked for execution, destroy their identification tags, and enter their numbers into the file.
What reason was given for the execution of these prisoners of war?
We were dealing with the annihilation of an ideology. With their fanatical political orientation, these prisoners constituted a threat to the camp security.
Where were the executions carried out?
In the courtyard of Barak 11.
Did you take part in the execution?
In one instance, yes.
What was the procedure?
The roll was called and the formalities concluded. They were taken to the courtyard, and after the other, it was almost over. Then Grabner said, "Stark, you carry on." Up to then, the other corporals had been taking turns.
How many did you shoot?
I can't remember.
More than one?
Yes,
More than two?
4 or 5, possibly.
Did you try to get out of taking part in the execution?
But it was an order. It was my duty as a soldier.
Did you participate in any other execution?
No, I was given leave to complete my studies
When did your leave begin?
in December 1941.
When did you complete your studies?
I passed my examinations in the spring of 1942.
Did you then return to the camp?
For a short time, yes.
We would like to call to the attention of the court the fact that our client was 20 years old when he was ordered to camp duty. As witnesses have substantiated, our client had keen intellectual interests, and his whole personality made him utterly unfit for the task assigned to him. We would like to call to attention to the fact that 1 year after completing his secondary schooling, our client was granted a further period of leave to study law. In the last year of the war, he was wounded in frontline action. Immediately after the war, as soon as he was able to settle down in normal conditions, he went on to develop in exemplary fashion. He studied agriculture, passed his assessor's examination, was an expert with the Economic Advisory Council, and until his arrest, was an instructor in agricultural school.
Accused Stark, did you take part in the first gassings which were carried out on Soviet prisoners of war?
No,
Oh, sorry. In the first weeks of September 1941.
no,
Large-scale extermination of Soviet prisoners of war began in the fall and winter of 1941. They resulted in the deaths of 25,000 men. You processed these prisoners. You knew of their death. You consented to their death, and you performed essential parts of the operation.
We strongly protest these attacks on our clients. Such wholesale accusations are completely meaningless. Only clear-cut proofs of criminal acts or conspiracy in committing such acts in relation to the charges of murder are relevant to these proceedings. Wherever there is the slightest doubt, the benefit must be given to the accused.
Accused Stark, you never once took part in the gassings?
there was one time I had to.
How many prisoners were involved?
Somewhere around 150, for truckloads anyway.
Who were the prisoners?
It was a mixed transport.
What was your job?
I stood outside by the stairs after I had led them into the crematorium. The medical orderlies in charge of the gassing had locked the doors and were making the necessary preparations.
What kind of preparations?
They got out the cans and put on their gas masks. Then they went up the embankment to the roof deck. Usually it took 4 men to do the job. This time there were only 3. And they called back. They needed someone to help them out. Since I was the only one around, Grabner said, "Move." Give them a hand. Then the camp leader came over and said rather sharply, "If you don't go up there, in you go." So I had to go up and help Kurt.
Where was the gas thrown in?
So vents in the deck.
What did the people in the chamber below do then?
I don't know.
You didn't hear anything of what was going on down there?
They screamed.
For how long?
Around 10, 15 minutes.
Who opened the chamber afterward?
One of the orderlies.
What did you see in there?
I didn't take a very close look.
Did you see anything wrong with what you saw there?
No, not at all. Only the way it was done.
What do you mean?
If they had been shot, it would have been one thing. But the use of gas was unmanly and cowardly.
Accused Stark, during the course of your duties, didn't you ever have any doubt about your conduct in the camp?
Your Honor, I would like to explain that. Every third word we heard, even back in grammar school, was about how they were to blame for everything and how they ought to be weeded out. It was hammered into us that this would only be for the good of our people. In leadership school, we were taught above all to accept everything without question. If anybody did raise a question, they were told what is being done is done strictly according to the law. We were told, you've got to study, you've got to have an education. It's more important than food. Your Honor, we weren't supposed to think for ourselves. There were others around to do our thinking for us.
And scene.
I'm going to take that one back.
You
I want you
should.
to stay up for a second. So, well, thank you all for that performance. I imagine not simple. I wanted to open up to questions from you all as you think about, what the possibilities of documentary theater, very much like this, might be. What kind of ethical questions come to mind? Does it make you feel uncomfortable? Does it help you access, in some ways, perhaps the crimes in a different way? And also, our TAs are darn good actors and actresses. So thank you. What do you think? Mm-hmm.
Earlier, but in the scene as well, like that they weren't able to think for themselves, so it kind of brings up the idea of propaganda and like how much people who were like young teens during the rise of the power, like how they were indoctrinated from so young, like whether or not that's ethically more okay for them to have been complicit in these things because they were taught from so young.
Right. So the question about the age, and also part of his Stark's defense was the fact that he was 20 at the time and had been indoctrinated, as he says, and whether that would be, you're maybe the fact that you were not quite, entirely, mature, as to whether that would be a defense. And I mean, it's something that obviously we have to confront. I mean, many of the participants in the genocide were in their 20s and early 30s. They weren't, terribly old. Most of the leadership was in their 40s.
Your own free will, and the witnesses were talking about how he was shooting people in the legs so they could walk. And I feel like that's a little extra. I'm told women can do that. So I feel like that is one way to differentiate between somebody who's forced and coerced against their will, and somebody who's just doing it for the fun of it.
Yeah. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's just really, that's a very important comment, which is the issue of you've been forced to do something and you're doing it as a kind of obedience, versus someone who not only does that but is also cruel. That is to say, they do more. That they didn't have to go that extra step. And I think this is something that you would see in general, and you think about policing in general. I mean, there's a question of you could enforce the law, whatever the law may be, and there's a question of do you have to be cruel when you're doing that, and what cruelty means. And that's, I think, a question of free will, certainly there. I mean, a decision to take it a step further, so to speak.
How are the trials different for
How were they different? Right. Well, structurally, they weren't a lot different. That is to say, they function essentially like this. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, if you read some of the trial proceedings, like the Eichmann trial proceedings, or also the ones that are in the investigation, is that often there's a level, I guess I would say, almost of farcicalness of the kind of, and you saw a little bit of that back and forth with the counsel for the defense and the counsel and the prosecuting attorney. You know, almost like nitpicking, you know, what was it, 5 or was it 6? Was it this day or was it that day? Oh, we don't know what day it is, so therefore the whole thing can't possibly be true. This is a kind of a structural kind of problem of, you know, having to produce evidence and proof within the kind of discourse of a legal system, which is, you know, you have attorneys who represent your, you know, the clients, you have witnesses who are brought forward, you have a judge or sometimes a jury who makes decisions. And structurally, this is repeated, you know, from 1945 with the Nuremberg trials all the way up through, you know, trials that have still taken place in the 2000s in Germany. So there's not a lot of difference in that regard. I mean, in terms of like where you might see differences are in terms of the what's handed down. So like Corporal Stark got 10 years in jail for, you know, whatever he did, which is not entirely clear, but you know, many of the ones, when camp commanders or the highest ranking SS officers were found, they generally were hung. They generally were executed. So in the case of the many low-ranking officials, kind of like, you know, rank and file participants within the Nazi kind of bureaucracy and the SS regime, most would serve something from several years to possibly life imprisonment, but very few would be executed for their crimes. So the results would be different. You know?
Was age and the way someone was subject to interrogation ever considered like a legitimate defense?
Not that I know of. Yeah, whether age was actually considered a legitimate defense, no, because I mean, you know, they're still tried essentially as adults, and still, you know, the question of, you know, making decisions. Yeah, I mean, it was always trying to identify what specific action did they carry out. That was always almost always the major issue, but they were tried as adults. Yeah.
I also just find it interesting that with the higher ranking people, it's a lot easier to like charge them with items when their names appear in all these like Nazi media, so like their signatures appear in all these items. But whereas with like the lower officers, like nowadays every cop has like a body cam and like there's
Right.
cameras and stuff that's much easier to document. But when it's he said, she said, and
Right.
he's claiming I never did anything, and they're claiming we were in a camp, we couldn't really see it, but we heard it. Like there's really the burden of proof falls on the people who are making the claim. Innocence is always assumed.
Right.
So I think it's a lot difficult for the lower ranking officers than it was for the higher.
Right, and the majority of the time when the accusations are coming, and the witnesses provide testimony, sometimes it's corroborative testimony, but ultimately it's witness testimony, which is, you know, it's fallible. And especially as you're talking about decades later, you know, people, you know, memory changes, right? And so, you know, not having a lot of, say, photographic evidence, there's very little photographic evidence that implicates SS officers in the scene of the crime. Very little. There's lots of documentation, some of which is signed, you know, of like goods that are, you know, goods, whether it's, you know, chemicals or whether it's, you know, trains and that kind of thing. All the logistics are documented, and often the victims are documented. And furthermore, the assets that are seized from the victims are documented. The thing that Franz Zuchamel, for example, did in Treblinka, and this is borne out in the thing I gave you, is he sorted the goods, basically wedding rings, gold teeth. I mean, you know, basically he claims his role was basically to, you know, participate in the sorting of looted assets that were basically culled from people's bodies. Did he actually kill people? Again, not exactly. He participated in a broader system, you know, of annihilation. So think about, I'm going to end now, but I want to think about the idea of performing this as a play. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about is, we talked about almost the objectivity of the trial, but we didn't think about it as like having it in the form of a play, and not only the form of a play, but also by your TAs. I'd like you to think about that, and it might actually be a good question to think about for Thursday as well, because we're going to see like what it is to talk about the form of literature, so fiction, in talking about the Holocaust. So this is still factuality, I'd say, but it's a play. So we'll take up from that question next time. Thank you.